Looking for no bullshit conversation about mental health? Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
Well, I want to welcome everybody to a special edition of Learn from People Who Lived It. We're going to call this the First Responders edition of this podcast because we're going to have a conversation today with Tony Rodarte, who is a first responder, was a first responder. And, you know, when you look up the stats online, it's just unbelievably heartbreaking when you see that police and fire are more likely to die from suicide than in the line of duty. And you see that 85% of first responders are experiencing some kind of mental health condition. And then you look at this stat that's staggering to me, which says that depression and PTSD are up 5 times for first responders. So clearly, we have a situation. Clearly, there's a conversation that needs to happen. And that's why I wanted to bring you in. So Tony, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity to jump into this topic.
Yeah, buddy. So you're a former first responder. Why don't you tell us kind of a little bit about how you got to this place right here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I retired 4 years ago, actually pretty much almost to the day, 4 years ago, I retired. Spent 20 years in law enforcement, spent my last 11 years in a homicide unit, and honestly spent most of my career in investigations, to be honest with you. Did a little bit of patrol time, but the vast majority of my career were in investigations. And I just saw the ugly side of society. I think the world in general doesn't know probably how violent the world is that we live in and the demons that are out there. And our men and women that are still protecting those communities are dealing with these demons oftentimes on their own. And you shared some of the stats. The stats are staggering, and we could talk till we're blue in the face about stats. But the reality is we need to address the elephant in the room. And that's making sure that our men and women that are still protecting these communities and going to work every single day know that there's support out there and know that there's people that care deeply about them. My story is kind of unique, and maybe we can get into that later, but I'm passionate about protecting first responders and providing care because I was a first responder that really didn't have anywhere to go, really wasn't sure what to do, and was left processing things on my own. Now, that's not to say that my agency wasn't great, and they were fantastic, actually. But I spent this career not really having the tools to process the things I was going to see and do. And I think that's part of the problem. I think we need to start not only giving the men and women the tools to process this, but to give them the support and to let them know it's okay to not be okay. You know, if you think about what a first responder's doing, that's not normal. That's not normal.
And you said it earlier. It's like the two most critical elements are that we provide them the support. They know they're not alone. And then that we provide them some tools, because like you said, there's demons out there. There's bad people out there. Things are going to happen. They're going to keep happening. And we're going to keep having first responders that need to deal with them. And, so that, it's not going away. Now your job is to support them and give them the tools they need to be as healthy as they can be. So I want to get into a little bit of your background, if you don't mind, man. You said you spent 11 years in homicide. That must have been, and I know you can't talk about details, but that must have been a wild ride. Like, your job every day was to go figure out why somebody died. And that's just we're not talking about a novel here that somebody wrote. This is your real life.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it, literally every single day that we went to work, it's the absolute worst day in the history of that family that you're dealing with. And it's like Groundhog Day. You wake up and repeat. You wake up and repeat. And not only that, but like you think about 11 years, I promise you can't imagine what I've seen in 11 years. I promise you. And there's also nothing you could say that would surprise me, that would shock me, that would make me say, no way, I can't believe that happened. I absolutely believe that happened. And I'm definitely happy to talk about that. I think we should talk about it, but I just want to lay some framework for you. I will not share details on what I've seen because it's not fair to you. You have your own issues to deal with, and I'm not going to put my images into your head, and I don't think that's fair for your audience either. But I think it's important that we acknowledge these topics and these conversations, and I'm an open book with you, and I'm happy to talk logistically. What does it look like? Kinds of stuff we did. Totally. I'll have these talk till I'm blue in the face, but don't ask me specifics because I'm just not going to share them. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to your family. Those are not the images that you need in your head.
Well, and I want to echo what Tony just said. Dr. Dave, our psychiatrist that works on our Reserve for Vets show, he's very, very clear about the fact that you can actually cause a traumatic response for somebody else by oversharing details. And so that is why, if you're a military veteran or you're a first responder, it isn't the kind of thing that you necessarily need to bring home and dump onto your family because they may not be able to handle it. You may actually give them, like I said, you may actually provide them a traumatic experience just by hearing what the person they love had to deal with that day. And so I'm glad to hear you say that. And I wasn't planning on asking any specifics, but what I do want to know is, I'm going to guess over the 11 years, the way you started, the way you finished looked a little bit differently. And so I'm going to ask you to recall the way you started. And the question that I want to know is, and let's go through a sequence here. So, you're on the job, you get the call, you're headed to a homicide. What are you thinking and feeling in those moments, Tony, just personally to get ready for what you're getting ready to see and experience? Yeah,
absolutely. So just from the homicide perspective, in those 11 years, that changed drastically too. So the first several years, I was a nervous Nelly. It's like, holy cow, am I ready for this? What is this going to look like? As you get more and more experience, you become more and more comfortable in that process. But the things I was addressing, like I'm constantly what-ifing. So if we're going to a homicide and we have some particulars on the initial scene, my brain is all over the place in terms of, motives, additional people involved. Are there going to be witnesses? Are there going to be forensic evidence? Do we have enough personnel going? If things go sideways, do we have the appropriate resources in place, tactical units, tactical teams, surveillance teams in place, things like that. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of moving pieces in an active investigation. I'm lucky in the sense that I had a pretty broad spectrum of experience. I worked active homicides. I worked unresolved or cold case. I prefer unresolved. Sometimes cold is a little calloused and mean to these families. I also worked on identified human remains, UHR cases. And I got a passion for specifically those UHR cases because those are people that have just been discarded. And there's no squeaky wheel to get the attention of law enforcement to figure out what happened to a loved one. Worked a bunch of those cases. So my experience is very broad. I covered a lot of stuff. I didn't, I probably spent the most time, in those 11 years, it was so scattered. But the order was worked active for several years to get my feet wet, then worked some unresolved cases, and then finished out my career working unidentified human remains. Covered a lot of ground.
Can we ask you a question? Did you guys talk about it after? Like, you go to a scene of the crime and you've all been exposed to it, a horrific situation. When you're done, are you sitting around with the fellas and the ladies that you work with and kind of debriefing and digesting that a little bit? Or does everybody just keep it inside and go, all right, what's next? All right, what's next?
So a little bit of both.
Okay.
A little bit of both. I will tell you, in the unit that I worked in, there were several, 3 squads all doing homicide work. And we were all really good about just making sure everybody's okay. Informally. We would talk, we would debrief. We wouldn't necessarily go into detail, but when there's a time to talk, when there's not a time to talk to. There were some horrific scenes where it just wasn't time to really acknowledge it or discuss it. There were other scenes that we could talk a little bit more openly. I will say that the men and women that do this, specifically in those homicide units, for the most part, they're really good at just protecting their own and looking out for their own. So we may not have a bunch of resources at our hands for mental health, but we have a lot of resources in the personal relationships of the men and women that we're working with. And I know when things are off key, when things aren't quite right with a partner, with somebody I'm working with, and if that's just a sidebar conversation. So those folks were always really good at just making sure that for the most part, we're okay. But let's be honest. If you ask me how I'm doing, what's my answer going to be? Good. good, fine. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a matter of reading the body language. I might be saying good, I might be saying fine, but do I look like I'm doing good? Do I look like I'm doing fine? And maybe that's just breaking bread. Maybe it's just getting some lunch. Maybe it's just, talking about the Diamondbacks. Let's talk about something else. But just know that I'm here and I care. And I was blessed when I was there. I worked with a bunch of amazing, not only stellar homicide detectives that were some of the best in the business, but people that genuinely cared about the other detectives they were working with. And that's my fear, that a lot of these specialty units may not have that close camaraderie. I don't know. I only have experience with a large agency, a good group of men and women. But all of these conversations, all of everything that I saw is what really forced us to start a nonprofit, to go after this and have these uncomfortable topics and advocate for first responders, because so many first responders are okay, fine, good. And I don't buy it. I lived in that world. I'm not buying it.
Talk to me a little bit about what your foundation is trying to do.
So what we are doing is we provide trauma therapy for police and fire all around the country. So whether you're in Phoenix, whether you're in Texas, Kansas, we match you with a trauma therapist in your area. And then our sole responsibility is just to write the check and pay for those services. We don't get involved with any of the treatment plans. We're not a mental health facility. We're a 501c3 that advocates for first responders. So another thing, what we do are things like this, these podcasts. We're going to continue to advocate and talk about first responders. I believe, and I fully believe this, that we live in a world for the most part that supports first responders.
Yes.
I believe the silent majority supports first responders. But it's tougher now. I retired 4 years ago. It's tougher now for these men and women that are doing this job every single day and have a bullseye on them. Everywhere they go, they're recorded, they're confronted. It's a totally different world. But to answer your question, that's what we do with this nonprofit. And we advocate for first responders. We want to have these uncomfortable conversations, and we want them to know that it's okay to not be okay. I lived in that world. I wasn't okay. I was a really good homicide cop. And I'm saved and blessed because of my amazing wife. Been married for 24 years. And she's the one that had dibs on me and was checking in with me. And, my story is I chose not to get help while I was working in that unit. But as soon as I retired, I went and got help. And it was the best thing I ever did. I met with somebody that gave me the tools to process what I was seeing, what I was experiencing, what I was feeling. And I felt like the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. Yeah. I want first responders right now, today, to know that there is help. You're not broken. You're bent. You're a little tweaked. We've all been a little tweaked. You can't do what you do every single day and not be impacted by it. But we don't want you to be a statistic. You shared the suicidal statistics. Those are outrageous. But what if we can put mom or dad back at the kitchen table? What if we can save a marriage? What if we can put a first responder at the soccer field on a Saturday watching a game instead of being withdrawn from the family or doing their own thing?
It's the truth, but you know the other truth too. It's just people have to want it for themselves, right? Yeah. And they have to make that decision that they're going to be in a place where they're like, okay, maybe I'm not okay right now. Maybe things are shifting, and Chad from Mental Joe, who's on our Reserve for Vets podcast, says all the time that when, he works with guys and oftentimes they don't even see it for themselves. They don't even know that they're like a complete anger storm around everybody, that nobody wants to really be around them because they're so volatile and they're so pissed off all the time. And, that's just one way that some people manifest their pain of PTSD and depression and anxiety and all the things that come along with it. I want to ask you specifically, Tony, was there the hardest day of your life? Did you have an experience that absolutely changed you?
No. So I think my experience, Matthew, to be honest with you, was a culmination of everything, doing everything for so long. There were some very specific incidents. We took a homicide of a police officer. It was impactful, obviously. It's very difficult to be in that world processing a fellow peace officer that's been murdered, but it's a homicide and it's handled just like a homicide investigation. But it's a bunch of incidents and they all kind of built up and collected. And I want to echo what you said. I lived in that world for 20 years. I didn't want help. Don't help me. Don't ask me for help. don't offer me help, I'm not interested. And that's what we do now. I can't help anybody that doesn't want help, but all the men and women that come forward are at that position in their life where they're ready to accept the help. And so what we're trying to do through the nonprofit is just engage in these conversations, because maybe a first responder will hear something in this podcast with you and I. Maybe something will click and they'll be, you know what, maybe that's a safe dude I can talk to. Maybe that's an organization I can reach out to. That's all we're trying to do. I
certainly hope so. Well, and you and I are trying to remove the stigma, because ultimately that's what stopped you in those 20 years from reaching out for help. You probably thought that the people around you were going to think you were weaker or lesser, or all of the things that go through a man, or probably a woman's brain too. You're weak. Why can't you handle it? This is the job. Suck it up. There's all these things that get and go through our brains when we're having this tough stuff. But man, to just sit there and go, all right, I just experienced something that was so off the charts for normalcy. I might want to go and download with somebody on that for a minute and figure out exactly how to process that thought and that emotion. Like you said, get a couple of tools to figure that out. Is there anything you could have said to you 20 years ago that would have changed your mind?
God, that's a great question, to be honest with you. Let me circle back around to that. But I'm thinking, when I went through the police academy years ago, 25 years ago, I like to think it's a different police academy now. I like to think that we're addressing some of these things. When I went through the academy, it's like, look left, look right. So many of you are going to be divorced. So many are going to be killed in the line of duty. Just like horrific statistics. And they package you with that. They send you out and say, don't get killed, stay alive. So I like to think the academy is being processed a little bit differently. But to answer your question specifically about what could I have said, I don't know, to be honest with you. And I don't know because I don't know that I was ready to listen. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that it matters what was said. My thought process was, and again, my agency probably would have been supportive and helped me, but I just came from that old school breed where you don't show any signs of weakness. No cracks in my armor. I don't want to be considered unfit for duty. I don't want to get wheeled out and get transferred to another unit. I knew that I wanted to do 20 years. And as I got closer and closer to that, I was less willing to talk about that because I didn't want a paper trail. I didn't want anybody to find out I was talking to anybody. Well, those are the stigmas I want to get rid of. That's what I want to start talking about. If I had somebody come alongside me and say, hey, I know this safe place that you can reach out to, and your agency doesn't need to know, your homicide lieutenant doesn't need to know, your HR for your agency doesn't need to know, heck, your spouse doesn't even need to know. Just look at this website. Maybe that would have worked. I don't know, but that's a great question. And you really got me kind of scratching my head because I need to be able to answer that if we're going to positively impact some first responders now.
Yeah, because we have to break in. It's like you almost have to use really targeted language. Like if you're in your 20s right now, I know you feel 10 feet tall and bulletproof. And I know you feel like all of this stuff is manageable and you're going to be great. And the truth of the matter is you're going to be great until you're not. You are going to be okay until you're not. And so what we're saying is maybe older, wiser men is start to develop some tools now so that you don't have to do so much catching up when you're in your mid 40s, early 50s. Because what's interesting, as I, took a diversion from my last career, is it's a pretty common thing. Everybody talks about the midlife crisis and all of that stuff. And I like to call it the midlife moment. And I actually work with a healer who says everybody should go through a midlife crisis. Everybody should go through a midlife moment. Everybody in their late 40s, early 50s should be starting to ask bigger questions about what's possible and what can they do. And are they really fulfilling their goals and purpose in life? And so I guess what I'm here to tell people in their 20s and early 30s is that moment is going to come. It's going to show up for you at some point. And we just like you to be more prepared for it. That's it, more prepared for it. And it sounds like the resources you provide will give people the tools to get that stuff done.
And part of that process, Matthew, is just talking about it.
Yes.
We're having those conversations now. I wasn't exposed to those conversations when I was in my 20s and 30s. So that's a big part of it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I don't know how you erase the stigma with people because you still will. You'll always have that contingency of people that, say, suck it up and this is the job and toughen up. And listen, I always tell people they're not wrong. right? Well, while you're in your moment dealing with your homicide, yes, your feelings don't matter so much right now.
Right.
But when you are out of that moment, now we need to tend to those feelings and emotions. So can I ask you specifically, Tony, what kinds of thoughts, feelings, and emotions you experienced when you retired?
When I retired? Yeah, so it's interesting. You go for, so there's a unique phase, and I want your first responders to hear this. When you go from this transition of retirement, I worked from literally working in a homicide unit to being a civilian overnight. And that in and of itself was a unique process. I got a little old school in me. When I went into law enforcement, I went in as nobody. Nobody knew who I was. My goal was to get through the academy and have them not know my name. That was my goal. Went in nice and quiet, had a great career, but I was damaged. I was bent a little bit when it was time to leave. And so I elected no fanfare, no email to the agency, no goodbye party, no nothing. I elected just to go out the way that I went in, nice and quiet. That's what I needed for my healing. And in hindsight, I don't know that that was the best thing for my family either. My family had spent 20 years supporting me, being actively involved with what I had done. And that's what I needed to do to process where I was at. In hindsight, it probably was not the best thing, but it was what I needed to do at that point of where I was at.
Why do you think that? Why do you think it wasn't the best thing?
Because here's why. My wife is amazing. If I could just pause and say my wife is just amazing. I have a wife who has a professional career. She's a physician. She's worked her tail off, but she spent her entire career, for the most part, backseat to my career. Because in that homicide unit, I'm either on call or I'm a phone call away from being on call. So you're never really off. I can't tell you how many times I missed parties, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. You can't live in that world for over a decade and be a great dad. You can't. But my wife took backstage to everything that was going on, and yet blossomed this career and did amazing things. And I don't think she got the acknowledgement that she should have got when it was time to retire and it was time to move on to that next phase. And I know there's a lot of amazing spouses out there. I'll be honest with you. There's some first responders that are never going to get help, but there's some spouses of first responders that are completely broken, and we got to get help. And we are actually offering help to spouses through the nonprofit Retirees. But I just wanted to pause for a minute, and I'm unique because I have a great marriage. I have a great wife. If I didn't have a great wife, I don't know how the career would have ended. I don't know. Would I have been a statistic? Would I still be married? Would I literally have no clue. But I don't think our spouses that are so supportive get enough say in this process. And my wife was, so when I went into homicide, my kids were young. I have soon to be 20-year-old twins, and they were, I don't know, like 5 or so when we went into this. And I asked my wife, just give me a year. In 1 year, we'll revisit this and process this. And we would do that every 12 months. And I kept getting the blessing to move on. As my kids got older, I would ask them. They would give me the blessing. We would move on. But as we got to like 16 years on the job, 17 years on the job, my wife is like, this might be time to talk to somebody. And I was like, nah, 20 years, there's a stigma associated with this. I want to get to my 20 years and move on. And she was totally supportive. That's not what she wanted. That wasn't the answer she wanted, but she continued to support me through that process. So there's a lot of tie-in to my wife when I talk about that may have not been the right aspect, because I just want her acknowledged a little bit more for what she did and the sacrifice that she made. Again, I can't tell you enough. I'm a lucky one. Married 24 years. My wife is amazing. I worked with a lot of people on multiple marriages, multiple vices that they were dealing with of their own. And I'm thankful to have her and have that support, and to honestly to be doing this nonprofit with her. She brings a spouse's perspective to a first responder that I think is a totally forgotten people class. And I want to target some of those spouses out there and let them know you're not alone either. And my wife can speak firsthand to what it's like to be married to a cop for 20 years. There's a lot of folks out there. It's just finding those ones and connecting them.
It's a really unique job being and people in the military kind of have this same vibe, right? It's like they go to work and they might not come home. Like they go to work and something awful could happen to them. And so I would only imagine as a spouse, well, you'd have to find a special place to tuck that emotion, or it would be a really hard thing to roll with.
So totally. And so for my wife, my thing was, I don't want to go to work upset. I don't want to go to work angry. There's enough I'm going to see during the day. There's enough that I'm going to encounter that are going to spark several emotions, and anger may be one of them. I don't want that on my plate leaving my house. Now, does that mean my marriage was rosy every single time I went to work? Absolutely not. But my wife respected that and honored that even if we're in the middle of a fight, or not a fight, an argument, a disagreement, it's pause time. I'm going to work in an hour. It's time to unwind, get my mind right, to go in there and to see and process what we're going to do. There's a lot of spouses that know that and they'll push the buttons, but there's a lot of amazing supportive spouses. I had one of the amazing supportive ones. Another thing that was successful for me is I was able to compartmentalize. So I would go to work. My whole goal, and I hope, Matthew, if you talk to my kids today and asked them this question, this would be the answer. But my goal was to be a really good dad and an awesome husband, but to be a good homicide cop. And I didn't want that flip-flopped. And I'm happy to talk about this, and we need to talk about this, but you're never going to hear me say I love being a cop. I love being a homicide cop because that defines people. I love being married. I love my children. I love my wife. And that's what I had to do every single day to get through that. I think where guys get into trouble is where they're defined by this occupation and they love being a cop. They have all cop friends. They can't turn it off. That's all they talk about. Then they hit conflict, they hit problems, they can't process it. And now they're a suicide statistic. I was really good at compartmentalizing. I left the homicide world and I came home. Now, it was short-lived a lot of times because that phone would ring and I'm right back in it. But I was never talking shop. I never shared any details with my wife because I value my marriage too much. I never talked to my kids about this. I just couldn't do that. I lived in that world a long time. I needed the safe place at home to be able to not go down that road.
I want to ask you a question based on something you just said, and I wrote this down earlier, but how does seeing all that bad stuff affect you as a parent and a husband? And what I'm imagining is like your kids couldn't do anything because you were like, no way, because this is going to happen and this is going to happen and this is going to happen. But obviously I'm being a little over the top there, but yeah, speak to that a little.
So I felt like I was always pretty grounded.
Okay, good.
I wasn't overly cautious, but it would be great for you to ask my family these questions because I may think I have the right answer and I'd be curious what their answer is. But, I still let them leave the house on their own, go places. I wasn't a helicopter parent. I wasn't all over them, but I wanted to know what they were doing. And I wanted my children to be truthful with me at all times. And that's the difficulty of being married to a cop. I mean, my kids, like I said, they're going to be 20. They knew from very early on, you're not going to lie to me. You can't lie to me. You can't get out of it. I'd rather you just be truthful and honest with me. But to answer your question specifically on what I saw, I just learned very early on, the world's just a violent world. There were a lot of conversations I had with my children that may or may not have been appropriate. I don't care. I deemed it necessary. We talked about a lot of stuff. I created a safe place at home for my kids to talk. And there was no subject that was taboo. There wasn't anything you could ask. So there were some conversations I had to frame so that a 10-year-old could understand, a 15-year-old could understand. But the adult version of that was chaos and violence and destruction. But I really think by just communicating with my kids, for the most part, they're pretty squared away. I did some role playing on stranger danger stuff, some gun safety stuff. But if we don't have these conversations with our kids, how can we ever expect them to win? How can we ever expect them to survive if I never talk to them about the dangers of child abduction and getting pulled into a car or inappropriate contact with an adult or anything like that? So my job magnified that 100%. But yeah, I've said forever, my kids are going to be two squared away troops or absolute destruction after being raised by a cop. I hope they're going to be good.
That's great, man. Would you ever suggest a career as a first responder to your own children?
Yes and no. My daughter, for the longest time, wanted to be a police officer, and I never really supported that. But as my children become adults, my kids are adults now. I've had the opportunity to step away from this career a little bit. I've been able to give them insight. I think there's still some value in it. I mean, the bottom line is the world still needs first responders. I might push my daughter to maybe go fire instead of police, but, to answer your question, I would. There was a time when I wouldn't, but I think at that point I was just too close to the forest to even see the trees. I don't want anybody in my family going through this and dealing with what I dealt with, but I would absolutely entertain that thought.
Yeah, I think that, forever I said I would never tell my kids to be a radio personality because of the demand and the grind and the whole thing. But as I get older, I too share your sentiment. I say, no, hold on. I think you can do it, but here's what I would adjust. Here's what I would tell you to do differently and attack this thing just a little bit differently so you don't go down the same road that I did. Or maybe, you just try to prevent a few bumps and bruises along the way for our kids. Yeah. Here's what I want to talk about here for just a little while. What do you think is being done in the first responder space right now internally to help people?
So it's kind of agency specific.
Okay.
I will say out here in the Valley, there's some agencies are better than other agencies, but for the most part, I can honestly say this. I feel like most every agency now cares deeply about the mental health of their first responders. Now, what they're doing at what level, I don't know, but I can't tell you that was a sentiment 25 years ago. So that gives me hope that these agencies know, and they see these statistics. You can't run an agency, know these statistics and not address it. So I'm thankful for that. I will tell you this too. I feel like some of the younger first responders also know some of these signs. We've experienced it with our organization, younger first responders reaching out. When I had a handful of years on, and it absolutely never would have crossed my mind to reach out, but we're seeing younger and younger men and women reach out. So that gives me hope too. But the big picture is that the agencies are aware of these stats and they're having those conversations. And that's really all we can ask for. That's where we got to start. At least they're acknowledging it. And let's see if we can come up with something together on creating a safe environment.
Yeah, well, listen, like I've always maintained, this is going to keep happening. You're going to keep having these episodes. First responders are going to have to find a way to deal with and sift through these emotions because they're going to keep happening. And for most all of us, as long as we cycle through the emotion in a decent way, in a healthy way, maybe with a guide or a therapist or something like that, like it can be manageable. My buddy Chad says a bad day doesn't have to mean a bad life. And I just love that. You can have a crappy 15, 20, 30 minutes. It doesn't have to define the entire trajectory of your life. But if you keep it inside and you never deal with it, it will hold on to you. And that's really the motivation behind talking to somebody, is that it leaves your body. You create space for something different and new. How has your healing been?
So my healing has been actually pretty good. Am I perfect? No, I don't think I'll ever be perfect. You can't see and do what you did and come out the same person that you were. But I'm in a safe place. I'm in a good place. I'm in a happy place, which is important. But I want others to experience that. And that motivates me every single day to keep having these conversations and to get uncomfortable and talk about this in hopes that somebody's going to hear something and that light bulb's going to click and there's going to be one more person that we can reach out to.
All right, man. Final question. You're one-on-one with a 28-year-old first responder who's just getting started. What do you want to tell him?
I want to tell them it's okay to not be okay. It's okay. It's important that these folks know that we have this persona where we have to be, like you mentioned earlier, 10 feet tall and bulletproof. That's a bunch of hogwash. We got to do what we got to do to stay alive. And there's some certain tactical scenarios that go into play on that. But we have to know 28-year-old Tony Rodarte needed to know that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay. There's resources out there. There's people out there. Just know that, because I didn't know that at 28 years old. I thought I had to be okay.
Well, the Compassion Alliance, this is where you guys come into play. And if you're a first responder and you're listening to our podcast right now and you know that this is speaking to you, I'm going to ask that you take a look at his website. Go on over to compassion-alliance.org and you'll be able to find and start right there. Where do you recommend they begin on your website, Tony?
Right there. Just hit the website.
Okay.
If it resonates with you, stay there. There's a contact us page. Our goal is when you reach out to us, we're going to make immediate contact. When you contact us for help, you're ready for help, and we're ready to meet you right there. So hit that website when you're ready. And in the meantime, we care deeply about the men and women that are still wearing that badge and protecting their communities through fire, police, and EMS. And we're going to keep talking and advocating because we care deeply about them.
Amen, brother. The only way to attack that stat and those stats I talked about up front is to keep having this conversation surrounding stigma. And like you said, letting people know it's okay not to be okay. Tony, thank you so much for your time, for your vision, and for sharing your story with us. I really appreciate that. Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity, buddy.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.